Funny how people keep giving orders after they've lost the authority to make them matter, as if repeating themselves loudly enough will somehow bring the old world back. They remember the version of you who explained yourself, waited for approval, tolerated disrespect, and followed rules that were never designed to protect you. So they keep talking to that person. They haven't noticed that person isn't running the show anymore. The game changed quietly. No announcement. No dramatic ceremony. You simply stopped reacting the way they expected. You started questioning instructions instead of automatically obeying them. You started recognizing manipulation disguised as concern, pressure disguised as advice, and control disguised as friendship. Suddenly their commands don't sound powerful anymore. They sound desperate. But here's the dangerous part when you finally become independent. Don't confuse independence with rebellion. You don't need to reject everything just because someone told you to do it. Think for yourself. Listen when advice makes sense. Walk away when control replaces respect. Make decisions based on evidence, values, and consequences instead of ego. Real power isn't shouting, "You can't control me." It's quietly becoming someone who doesn't need to be controlled because you can control yourself. Let them keep giving orders if they want. You don't have to fight every command. Sometimes you simply don't respond. Sometimes you take the useful information and ignore the manipulation wrapped around it. Sometimes the biggest change is realizing you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to, while the people expecting the old version of you keep waiting for obedience that isn't coming, watching you become more deliberate, more disciplined, and far less interested in playing a role written by somebody else. Because once you understand that the game has changed, you stop wasting your energy explaining why you won't return to the old one. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can give you the same dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy without copying the character's specific dialogue style. There comes a moment when you finally realize that some of the rules controlling your life were never actually rules. They were expectations repeated so many times that you eventually mistook them for laws. And that's when things become interesting, because suddenly you start asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Why should I keep doing this? Who decided this was the only way? Does this rule still make sense? And what happens if I stop living according to something that no longer fits the person I've become? Because people love familiar versions of you, especially when those versions are predictable, obedient, available, and easy to influence. But growth has a nasty habit of making you unpredictable to people who benefited from your old limitations, and when you start questioning those limitations, they may accuse you of changing as if changing were some kind of crime. But of course you changed. You're supposed to change. You're supposed to learn from experience, recognize mistakes, develop stronger standards, and stop carrying rules that were built for a version of you that no longer exists, while some people will tell you that respect means obedience. But those are not the same thing. You can respect someone without surrendering your judgment. You can appreciate tradition without following every tradition blindly. You can listen to authority without assuming authority is automatically correct. Because thinking for yourself doesn't mean believing you're always right. It means being willing to examine what you're told before you decide whether it deserves your agreement. And that requires courage, because it's much easier to follow the crowd than to question the direction everyone is walking, especially when questioning the direction makes you look difficult, rebellious, or inconvenient. But convenience has never been a reliable measurement of truth. And if an old rule prevents you from becoming healthier, wiser, more responsible, or more capable, then it deserves examination, not worship. While you begin separating useful principles from outdated expectations, you discover that some rules were created to protect people. Some were created because they made life easier, and some simply survived because nobody bothered to question them. And that's where maturity enters the room. Because maturity isn't destroying every rule just because someone else created it. That's childish rebellion. Maturity is knowing which rules deserve to remain and which ones need to be replaced. Because sometimes the rule you need to break is actually the rule you created for yourself. The belief that you must always please everyone. The belief that failure makes you worthless. The belief that asking for help makes you weak. The belief that your past determines your future. The belief that you must remain the same person just because people became comfortable with that version of you. And once those beliefs begin collapsing, you may feel strangely exposed, because now you have fewer excuses. You can't blame the old expectations for every decision you have to choose, and choice creates responsibility, while other people continue following instructions simply because they're instructions. You can pause and ask whether those instructions are actually taking you somewhere worth going. And if they aren't, you don't need a dramatic rebellion. You can simply change direction, quietly, deliberately, responsibly, knowing that not every person will understand why, not every person will support it, and not every person needs to, because your responsibility is not to make everyone comfortable with your evolution. Your responsibility is to make thoughtful decisions and accept the consequences, while you stop allowing outdated expectations to dictate your future. You become more intentional about what you believe, what you tolerate, what you pursue, and what you refuse. And that creates a different kind of confidence, not the loud confidence that demands everyone recognize your independence, but the quieter confidence that allows you to think clearly even when nobody agrees. Because once you stop treating every old rule as sacred, you can finally start treating your own judgment as something worth developing, testing, correcting, and strengthening, while the people who preferred the old version of you continue waiting for you to return. You continue moving forward, not because you need to prove them wrong, but because you finally understand that your life cannot be built entirely from instructions written by people who will never have to live with the consequences of your choices. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can give you the same dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy without copying the character's specific dialogue style. There is a strange comfort in letting other people do your thinking for you. Because if someone else makes the decision, you never have to carry the full weight of being wrong. You can simply point at them later and say, "You told me to do it." As if responsibility magically disappears when somebody gives an order. But that's not freedom. That's outsourcing your life. And eventually you have to ask yourself whether you're actually making choices or simply reacting to whoever speaks with the most confidence, the loudest voice, the strongest personality, or the most impressive title. Because authority can be useful, experience can be valuable, and advice can save you from mistakes, but none of those things should automatically replace your judgment. Thinking for yourself doesn't mean rejecting every idea you didn't invent. It means examining ideas before accepting them. Asking questions without being afraid of looking ignorant, checking evidence instead of relying on rumors, and being willing to change your mind when better information appears, which is actually much harder than stubbornly defending whatever you believed yesterday. Because ego wants consistency, while intelligence wants accuracy. And sometimes being intelligent means admitting that you were wrong, learning something new, and moving forward without turning the correction into a personal humiliation, while the world constantly tries to tell you what to buy, what to believe, who to admire, who to hate, what success should look like, what relationships should look like, and what kind of person you're supposed to become. You have to develop the habit of pausing before accepting the script, because if you never question the script, you may spend years performing a role you never consciously chose, and then one day you wake up wondering why your life feels strangely unfamiliar, why your goals don't excite you, why you're exhausted from maintaining expectations that were never truly yours, While other people insist that their way is the only sensible way, you can ask a simple question: what evidence makes that true? And sometimes you'll discover there is excellent evidence, which means you can accept the advice without shame, and sometimes you'll discover there is nothing except tradition, fear, gossip, or somebody's personal preference, which means you are free to consider another path. But freedom requires responsibility, because once you think for yourself, you can't constantly blame everyone else when things go wrong. You have to own your decisions, learn from outcomes, correct your mistakes, and keep developing your judgment. And that is the price of independence. While people who are addicted to approval may choose whatever keeps the room happy, you learn to choose what you believe is right after considering the consequences, even when the decision is unpopular, not because disagreement makes you special, but because popularity is not the same thing as truth. And being surrounded by people who agree with you doesn't guarantee that you're correct. Just as being criticized doesn't automatically mean you're wrong, which is why emotional control matters when thinking independently, because if every disagreement feels like an attack on your identity, you'll never be able to examine ideas honestly. You'll defend your position simply because changing it feels humiliating, while a stronger mind can say, I may be wrong. Let me look again. And that sentence can save you from years of unnecessary mistakes. Because the goal isn't to become someone who never follows advice. The goal is to become someone who knows why they're following it. Someone who can separate wisdom from pressure, guidance from manipulation, evidence from assumption, and genuine concern from control. While you build that ability, you become harder to manipulate because confidence no longer comes from believing everything you hear. It comes from knowing how to evaluate what you hear, and once you develop that skill, you don't need to fear every person who disagrees with you. You can listen, consider, question, reject, accept, or revise without turning every conversation into a battle for dominance. Because your mind becomes a place where ideas are examined rather than worshipped. And that is where genuine independence begins. Not in shouting that nobody can tell you what to do, but in becoming capable enough to listen to everyone without becoming controlled by everyone. While you continue learning, questioning, testing, and correcting yourself, refusing to let confidence become arrogance or skepticism become cynicism, because the strongest thinker isn't the person who doubts everything. It's the person who knows what deserves doubt, what deserves trust, and what deserves more investigation before a decision is made, allowing you to move through a noisy world without becoming another echo of whoever happens to speak the loudest. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. There is a childish kind of freedom that says, nobody can tell me what to do, as if doing the opposite of everything you're told automatically makes you independent. But that's not freedom. That's just another form of control. Because if someone says go left, and you become obsessed with going right, they are still deciding your direction. You're simply reacting in reverse. And that's the trap people don't notice when they become desperate to prove they can't be controlled. They start allowing other people's expectations to dictate their behavior without realizing it, because rebellion can still revolve around the person you're rebelling against, while genuine independence revolves around you, your values, your judgment, your goals, and your understanding of consequences, which means sometimes you will agree with someone who gives you an order, and sometimes you will refuse. Not because you need to prove anything, but because you've actually thought about what makes sense. And that distinction is everything, because if a doctor gives you useful advice, listening isn't weakness. If a mentor gives you valuable guidance, learning isn't submission. If someone points out a mistake you genuinely made, correcting it isn't surrender. And if a rule protects you or other people from unnecessary harm, following it can be the intelligent choice. While rebellion for the sake of rebellion is just ego wearing a leather jacket, making noise while accomplishing very little. Because the goal isn't to appear uncontrollable. The goal is to become self-directed. And self-direction requires discipline, patience, information, and the willingness to accept responsibility when your choices produce consequences, while other people are busy proving that nobody owns them. You can quietly ask a better question: what choice actually serves my future? And sometimes that choice will look rebellious. Sometimes it will look conventional. And sometimes it will look so ordinary that nobody notices. But that's fine, because your life isn't supposed to be a performance designed to impress people with how independent you are. You're supposed to build a life you can actually live with, and that requires making decisions based on more than emotion, especially when you're angry, embarrassed, rejected, or desperate to prove someone wrong, because those are the exact moments when people make choices that feel powerful for 5 minutes and expensive for 5 years, while real independence means you can pause even when your ego is screaming for immediate action. You can hear criticism without automatically obeying it or rejecting it. You can accept help without becoming dependent, and you can walk away from pressure without turning your entire life into a war against authority. Because not every instruction is manipulation, and not every disagreement is oppression. Sometimes someone simply sees something you haven't considered, and being mature enough to examine that possibility doesn't make you weak. It makes you harder to fool, including by yourself. While you become more independent, your need to announce that independence becomes smaller, because you don't need to constantly tell people that you're free when your choices already demonstrate that you can think, decide, adapt, and take responsibility. And that's a much stronger position than reacting to every person who tries to control you, because reaction still gives them influence, while deliberate choice takes that influence away, allowing you to say yes when yes makes sense, no when no is necessary, and maybe when you genuinely need more information, without turning every decision into a test of your toughness, while the world keeps presenting you with rules, expectations, opinions, traditions, trends, and people who insist they know what's best for you. You can listen without surrendering, question without insulting, disagree without becoming destructive, and choose without needing applause. Because independence isn't the absence of influence, it's the ability to evaluate influence before allowing it to shape your life. And once you understand that, you stop fighting imaginary battles just to prove you're free. You stop making reckless decisions simply because someone told you not to, and you start using your freedom for something far more valuable than rebellion. Building a life directed by judgment instead of impulse, responsibility instead of ego, and purpose instead of the desperate need to prove that nobody can control you. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. People love the fantasy of controlling everything around them, controlling who respects them, who stays, who leaves, who apologizes, who agrees, who notices, who regrets, who loses, who wins, as if life would finally become peaceful if every person behaved exactly the way they wanted. But that's a beautiful little fantasy, because the moment you try to control everyone else, you discover how powerless you actually are, and the more you chase control outside yourself, the less control you have over the one person whose decisions actually determine your future. You, because you cannot command another person's thoughts, feelings, choices, or reactions, but you can learn to control whether anger makes your decisions, whether fear makes you quit, whether jealousy makes you compare, whether insecurity makes you seek approval, and whether pressure makes you abandon your values. And that's where real strength begins, not with domination, but with self-government. Because anybody can become loud when they're angry. Anybody can send the message they will regret tomorrow. Anybody can make a reckless decision while emotions are burning. But it takes discipline to pause and ask what outcome you actually want. And sometimes that pause is the difference between protecting your future and destroying it for the satisfaction of 5 minutes, while other people may try to provoke you, test you, criticize you, or manipulate you. Your greatest advantage is refusing to let their behavior dictate yours. Because if someone can make you become someone you don't respect simply by pushing the right button, then they have discovered a remote control for your personality. And that's not power. That's vulnerability. So learn your buttons. Learn what triggers you. Learn when you're most reactive. Learn what kinds of situations make you desperate for approval or desperate for revenge. Because awareness gives you a chance to interrupt the pattern, take a breath, step away, gather information, and decide what response actually serves you. While you practice that discipline, you become less dependent on immediate emotional relief. Because not every feeling needs to be acted upon. Anger can be acknowledged without becoming aggression. Fear can be acknowledged without becoming avoidance. Sadness can exist without becoming hopelessness. And excitement can exist without becoming recklessness, allowing you to experience emotions without handing them complete authority. Because emotional control isn't pretending you don't feel anything. It's developing enough awareness to choose what you do with what you feel. And that skill changes everything. Your relationships become less dramatic because you stop reacting to every misunderstanding. Your work becomes more consistent because your motivation isn't the only thing carrying you. Your decisions become clearer because you don't make permanent choices during temporary emotional storms. And your confidence becomes more stable because it isn't constantly dependent on what somebody else said yesterday. While the world keeps tempting you to control outcomes you cannot guarantee, you learn to focus on preparation, effort, communication, boundaries, and response, because those are the areas where your influence actually lives. And when something goes wrong, instead of asking, "How do I make them pay?" you can ask, "What can I learn? What can I change? And what do I need to protect now?" And that question moves you from revenge to responsibility, from reaction to strategy, from chaos to clarity. While you continue strengthening yourself, you may notice that you don't need to dominate conversations anymore. You don't need to win every argument. And you don't need to force people to recognize your value, because your attention is becoming too valuable to waste on controlling things that were never yours to control. And that is the strange paradox of power. The more you control yourself, the less desperate you become to control everything else. And the less desperate you become, the more freedom you actually experience, because your peace no longer depends on another person's behavior. Your confidence no longer depends on their approval, and your future no longer depends on whether they finally understand what you were trying to prove, leaving you with something far more useful than dominance: the ability to remain yourself when the environment around you becomes chaotic. The ability to choose your response when everyone expects a reaction, and the ability to walk away from a pointless battle without feeling like you've lost, because sometimes winning means refusing to play a game designed to destroy your peace. While you continue becoming disciplined enough to lead yourself before demanding that anyone else follow, building the kind of inner authority that doesn't require intimidation, applause, or permission, only the quiet decision to become responsible for the one life you can actually direct. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. People love explanations, because explanations give them something to argue with. And that's why the moment you start changing, everyone suddenly wants a presentation, a timeline, a detailed report explaining why you're different now, why you're quieter, why you're more selective, why you don't react the way you used to, why you stopped answering every message, why you stopped accepting every invitation, why you suddenly have standards, as if your personal growth requires a committee meeting before it becomes legitimate. But here's the thing. You don't need to announce every transformation. Because the strongest changes are usually visible through behavior long before they're understood through words. And if you've genuinely changed, you won't need to spend your life convincing people that you have. Your decisions will show it. Your habits will show it. Your boundaries will show it. Your patience will show it. And the way you handle pressure will show it, while people who remember the old version of you may continue testing the old buttons, expecting the same reactions, the same excuses, the same availability, and the same willingness to explain yourself, only to discover that the response they're looking for isn't there anymore. And that's where the real shift becomes obvious. Not because you announced that the game changed, but because you stopped playing by rules that no longer served you. While some people will try to pull you back into familiar arguments, familiar drama, familiar habits, and familiar roles, you can simply refuse to participate, because every time you react exactly as expected, you confirm that nothing has changed. But every time you pause, choose deliberately, and respond according to your values instead of their pressure, you demonstrate something far more powerful than a speech. You demonstrate self-control, and self-control is difficult to fake for very long, because eventually behavior exposes intention. You can tell everyone you're disciplined, but your routine will reveal whether you are. You can tell everyone you're confident, but your reactions to criticism will reveal whether you are. You can tell everyone you're independent, but your decisions under pressure will reveal whether you are. And you can tell everyone you've moved on, but the way you respond when the past appears again will reveal whether you actually have. Which means your goal shouldn't be to convince people that you've changed. Your goal should be to become so consistent that you no longer care whether they believe you. Because that's freedom, not needing witnesses for your progress. While the world keeps waiting for some dramatic announcement, you can continue working quietly, improving your skills, protecting your peace, managing your emotions, building your future, and making decisions that align with the person you're becoming. And eventually the evidence becomes too obvious to ignore. Not because you forced anyone to admit it, but because your life begins producing different results, and results are difficult to argue with. While other people may still talk about who you used to be, you don't have to correct every sentence, because they are describing a version of you that you're no longer responsible for maintaining. And the more secure you become, the less interested you are in proving that the old version is gone, because you know. And sometimes knowing is enough, while the people around you continue testing whether your boundaries are real. You don't need to threaten consequences. You simply enforce them. While they test whether your focus is real, you don't need to announce your goals. You simply keep working. While they test whether your confidence is real, you don't need to become aggressive. You simply remain composed. And every repeated action becomes another piece of evidence that the person they used to influence so easily is no longer available in the same way. Because you've replaced automatic reactions with deliberate choices, replaced approval, seeking with self-respect, replaced empty promises with consistent behavior, and replaced the need to win arguments with the desire to build a life that actually works. While people who expected your transformation to be temporary slowly realize that you aren't having a phase. You're developing standards, and standards change what you tolerate, what you pursue, what you prioritize, and what you walk away from, allowing you to move forward without dragging every old conflict behind you. Because the strongest response to people who underestimated you isn't revenge, humiliation, or endless confrontation. It's becoming so focused on your own direction that their opinion becomes irrelevant to the journey. And once your actions consistently match your values, you don't have to announce that the game changed. The way you live becomes the announcement. The discipline becomes the announcement. The calm becomes the announcement. The boundaries become the announcement. And the results become the announcement. While you keep moving without demanding, that everyone understand the transformation? Because you finally realize that the purpose of changing your life was never to make other people admit that you were right. It was to become someone who no longer needs their permission to keep going.